What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with Tech Daily, and in this video, we are doing a speed test comparison between a whole bunch of Samsung devices. We've got the A52 5G, the A72, the S20 FE, and the S21. Now, I think this is going to be a really interesting test because while these phones are technically all in a class of their own, the new 2021 A series phones, last year's FE, the current flagship S21, I think they're actually even more similar than ever, which makes deciding between them pretty tough. And if you're in the market for a new device and speed and performance are most important to you, seeing the real world difference side by side might help you make the right decision. So we're gonna go ahead and quickly just go over the specs of each device so we know what we're working with. We'll then get into the actual speed test itself, where I'll offer my thoughts and commentary along the way. And hopefully this helps you decide if any one of these devices is the right one for you. For the purposes of this video, we're going to be using the A52 5G, the US variant with the Snapdragon 750G 5G processor. We also have the A72. There's only one iteration of this device out right now, and it's powered by the Snapdragon 720G chipset. The S20 FE 5G US version, which has the Snapdragon 865 5G processor inside, and the flagship S21. Again, we've got the US model here with the newest, most powerful chipset, the Snapdragon 888 5G. To start off, here are the Geekbench scores for each of these devices, so you can kind of get a numerical value to compare. A couple of things to note. First off, even though the A72 is maybe technically a higher model device than the A52 5G, it does have a less powerful chipset inside, which yields those lower scores, which you can see. So already something worth considering in my opinion. Also, between the A series phones and the S series phones, the biggest difference definitely is in that multi-core score. And that's a product of the flagship caliber Snapdragon 800 series chipsets versus the upper mid-range 700 series processors. I think you'll see much more of a difference between the different tiers of phones, A series versus S series, rather than the individual devices themselves, but we'll get into all that in just a second. And one last thing to mention, as far as the RAM, the A52 5G, A72, and S21 all have 8 gigs inside, while the S20 FE has 6 gigs. Unfortunately, I know that kind of throws off the comparison a little bit, but maybe just keep that in mind when we dive into some multitasking and app switching. You may or may not be able to pick out just a bit of a difference there with less RAM on the S20 FE. So to keep things as fair as possible, all 4 of these phones have been updated to Android 11 and One UI 3.1. They've been set up exactly the same way with pretty much the same settings and apps installed, with the exception of just a few random default Samsung apps that differ slightly, and they've been charged up to at or near 100% as well, so everything should be as close as I can get it to being an even and honest test. In regards to just your average everyday default Android experience, I think you'll find that all 4 of these phones are generally pretty close when it comes to app launches and load times. We aren't doing anything too difficult here to start, obviously yet, but I think there's a good chunk of people out there who do just keep things pretty simple with their smartphone usage. If that's the case for you, overall, I think you'll see that the S20 FE and S21 can load up a fraction of a second faster than the 2 A series phones. But the difference, in my eyes, is just so minor that it doesn't really affect usage at all, and you probably wouldn't even notice unless you really analyzed it frame by frame. For average everyday use, getting one of the lower end phones here isn't going to be an issue, and you likely won't even notice any performance drop off in comparison. Now, I will say that while the S20 FE and S21 almost remain in tandem with one another, the animations and load times are really close, the A52 5G and A72 aren't always as similar with loading things. In fact, I think there's probably more instances where the A72 is the most noticeably behind the rest than anything else in the test. And while it's disappointing to see that, it really shouldn't come as a surprise. We know the A72 has the lowest spec processor out of the bunch. It's just kind of strange to see that when the A52 5G is I guess, supposed to be the lower level model in the lineup by comparison. And more than anything else, when just looking at what you're getting with the internal specs and performance, it obviously seems to make way more sense to just get the A52 5G instead of the A72. Between the S20 FE and S21, the difference is almost non-existent, so you could totally argue saving some money and sticking with the S20 FE instead if performance is all you're looking at. The real big question is just whether or not it makes sense going from the A52 5G to the S20 FE. That's probably where you'll experience the most significant performance boost, and you'll have to decide if that's worth it for you. I will say that if your smartphone usage is more phone calls, text messages, social media, YouTube, things like that, it's definitely okay to just snag the A52 5G. You won't be missing much in the performance front, but if you're a big multitasker, if you push your smartphones super hard for work or for play with graphics heavy games, if you're more of a power user in general, then yes, absolutely, just jump to the S20 FE. It's worth it for sure, and as we head into some games here in a moment, I think you'll see that difference. I will also mention that with app switching and multitasking, that difference between 6 gigs of RAM on the S20 FE and 8 gigs on the rest of the devices isn't too noticeable at all, at least in my tests. I didn't find any apps needing to be reloaded on the FE that held steady on the other phones, and I didn't find any sort of issues with app switching or keeping things current. And this too kind of makes sense. Between 6 and 8 gigs of RAM, the difference isn't as big percentage-wise as if you were to compare 4 and 6 gigs or 8 and 12 gigs. And you can get an S20 FE with 8 gigs of RAM anyway if you really want. But here, with these tests at least, I just don't really see it being a deciding factor. Nowadays, 6 gigs of RAM I think is enough for 99% of smartphones. 8 is just more of an extra added boost, and anything beyond that, in my opinion, I can't really imagine most people would fully utilize until you really start doing some super heavy stuff with your smartphone. Now, obviously, I know not everyone games, but I think seeing this side-by-side comparison really outlines the potential performance difference between all 4 phones, because launch and load times are really extended here, and the difference is much more obvious. Rather than just barely seeing a fraction of a second difference in app load times, we now see a second or two, maybe more, between all 4 devices. Now, is this a major deciding factor? I don't necessarily think so, but it more definitively showcases the differences you might get in going with one phone over another. Beyond the launch and load times, though, in-game performance is, in my opinion, identical across all 4 phones. I'd consider each one of these devices, from the A52 all the way up to the S21, stellar gaming phones, and you just aren't going to notice any performance issues, lag, frame drops, or anything like that with any one of these 4 phones. And that's great because if maybe your budget only allows for the A52 or A72, you can be confident in knowing you're still getting a stellar device. And on the flip side, I think it's also fair to say that what you might be paying for something like the S21, 30 or 40 or 50% more money in comparison, you aren't exactly getting as significant of a performance boost. So that's another thing to consider. While it is the newest, most powerful flagship on the market, I think you're really going to see some diminishing marginal returns when you start to spend all that extra money. Like I explained earlier, I think the difference is going to come down to A series versus S series more than anything else. Not so much A52 versus A72 or S20 FE versus S21. In my mind, you're getting way more value with the A52 5G, like I said. It's arguably the better phone in the A series lineup, and you're also getting crazy good value with the S20 FE still, even though it's last year's device with last year's flagship processor. The difference, in my opinion, is barely noticeable. You just now have to sort of determine whether or not you might want to spend some extra money going with the S20 FE, or if the A52 5G is fine for you. For me personally, I'm totally okay with the A52 5G. I also think we'll likely see an S21 FE here soon, which changes the discussion drastically as well. But all in all, I think you're probably going to get the most bang for your buck performance-wise in the A52 5G more than any other device in this lineup. But what do you guys think? Which phone do you think is the best overall value spec-wise and performance-wise? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course. But hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. Be sure to follow Tech Daily on Twitter and subscribe to the Tech Daily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.